Welcome back to this new episode of the Computational Antitrust Podcast. My name is Thibault Schrepel. I am a faculty affiliate with Stanford University Codex Center, an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam, and the creator of the Computational Antitrust Project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law.
And I am Alba Martínez, and recently I have joined VU Amsterdam as an assistant professor in law and technology, and I also serve as the editor-in-chief for the Stanford Computational Antitrust Journal. So as you very well know, this project brings together over 75 competition agencies and about roughly 50 academics on the advisory board. So every month or so, we publish an academic article on computational antitrust, and you can find all of those publications at computationalantitrust.com. And today's guests are Carlos Eduardo Veras Neves and Tanise Brandão both working on at CADE on their Cerebro project. Cerebro, which is Portuguese for brain, is an information technology tool that CADE created in 2013 to try to detect big rigging in public enforcement.
So, as you will hear in today's episode, Carlos and Tanise wrote a paper for us entitled Smart Agent-Based Modeling with LLMs, the subtitle being Leveraging Large Language Models for a Better Understanding of Algorithmic Collusion, a subject that has been heavily debated. This is the subject of our conversation today, in which you'll learn about what happens when two AI pricing agents are set loose in a simulated market and are allowed to talk to each other. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So we wanted to ask first, what did you set out to do within the paper, and what is the finding that you most want listeners to remember?
Okay, so what we did is we built a smart agent-based modeling framework, and we got two LLMs together in there to interact. We used a Bertrand model, and we used a duopoly with differentiated products. Also, we instructed them with natural language, and we say to them to maximize its profits. And in each round, we gave them the price, not the prices, the price they decided, but the demand and the profits. And after the interaction, the other price for the other person. And we ran it for 400 rounds and used two models and two languages. Carlos?
Thank you, Tanise. And I'd like to adapt that one thing that's important from our paper, that ever since Dragon stuck, they proposed the categorization of algorithmic collusion that OECD and most agents now use. There was one scenario that always felt like the hardest one to actually catch, is that the intelligent agents colluding autonomously, purely through observation and without anyone programming them to talk to each other or to cooperate. You had also experiments with reinforcement learning agents that get there basically by trial and error. But LLMs are kind of different because they get that through contextual reasoning, and they are drawing on pattern recognition from what they were trained on. So what this paper shows first, that isn't just theoretically possible and it's relatively cheap. You can run this sandbox today. The cost is not absurd. And another thing, this opens up a new kind of laboratory, as Roald Lucas put back in 1980s. And one of the functions of theoretical economics to build artificial economic systems that serve as labs in which policies and would be prohibitively expensive to test in actual economics, and they can test it at a much lower cost. So I think our paper just shows that how we can simulate this type of system in a maybe straightforward way. So
let me ask you a question of that, actually. So you mentioned that it is not expensive, right, to produce this kind of simulations, and you actually give it a name. You call that the Homo psittacus, which suggests you find a new kind of agent almost. So my question is this: since all of those agents have learned anything from human text, are we watching human collude through the machine, right, or represented by the machine, or are we simply watching indeed like a new type of collusion that is made by the machine?
I think, Thibault, that's a great question, actually. But first of all, the term Homo silicus was coined by Joe Horton back in 2023 in his paper. I can remember the name right now, so I'm sorry. But as Horton states, Homo economicus, let's start with Homo economicus, that is a mod of human being that you endow with resources, preference, information, so on, that is subject to a scenario and deduce its behavior mathematically. So here we have the LLMs that by nature of how they are trained, they can be thought of implicit computational models of humans. A Homo silicus is this. So you can use them in the same way that economists use the Homo economicus. The difference that with Homo silicus, you can explore that behavior through computational simulation in many ways different from the Homo economics. So I think in one sense you are watching something that's downstream for human text, but the richness of the simulation comes from the interaction between the two agents round after round. So I think this is the most important. You have something like that we call emergent behavior from the systems, that you have simple and local rules followed by individual agents that give rise to complex and organized pattern at the macro level. So that no agent was intended or planned to.
Yeah, let me maybe push back on that. So are we then watching humans? So is the simulation enabling us to better understand how humans will collude, right, by simulating all the interactions, as you just explained? Or is it a new kind of collusion, one that only concerns machine with different patterns, different reasons behind?
Well, I think at first there's one thing that I'd like to put, that is we are working in social science. So even if we were just using the machine to make what humans do, this would be a game, because many times in social sciences we cannot do that. I cannot say, well, let's try to make an oligopoly in one place and the other I will have competition. I can't do that, because if I do that, I'll harm consumers. And here, as we are an authority, as we work in the authority, we are not able to do that. And the only way that we can do that is through simulation. So the first part is that even if we were just mocking what we are doing with humans, this would be a game, because we cannot do this in practice. But actually, I think there's another preoccupation that is, it's like when we are working with machines, and when I say that we are doing that in this paper, but it's not only us. I think the whole market is doing this. Like now we have lots of enterprises that work with this kind of technology. And I think we are getting in a place where we have a perfect colluder that doesn't even need to collude to actually collude. So we might have no meeting, no agreement, no email. We have nothing that today we use as cardinal evidence to say that these firms combine, and even though they are combining. And there's a problem for us in antitrust to work and to see what we can do in the future.
Okay, so one more question on that. So it seems to me what you are describing is parallel behaviors, right? Which is not necessarily a collusion in the antitrust sense of the term. So I wonder whether what is the most impressive in those agents in how they collude is that they seem to know how to hide the collusion. And in fact, even one agent at some points report says, let's avoid red flags. So my question is this: that make an algorithm the perfect colluder, not in that it do not need a meeting with another one, but that in a sense it never forgets to hide the agreement?
I'd say yes, because of that, because it doesn't even need the meeting, because it will never forget, and it might follow the rules forever.
And
What's your answer on that,
Tanise,
Carlos? Is hiding the cartel or the collusion the main feature compared to the more human way of colluding?
Well, what I can say that we can rule out the possibility of steering those agents toward that kind of behavior deliberately or not. And even without deliberate steering, we know that the interaction with the environment or sometimes just internal drift can eventually push an agent that way, because the thing is that you have the simulation, you have a complex system. So you have that type of sensitivity to initial conditions. So in what I'm trying to say is that I think it's not so it is possible, yes, but I don't think you can ensure that they will just obey you to get to the collusion.
And so once we have addressed this, how the experiment was conducted, what it really measured, and what outcomes it produced, we can maybe move to part two. So how far does that finding those outcomes hold? And you were saying, Tanise, about the fact that you deployed 400 rounds of interactions and you used two different LLMs in two different languages. So, and you were also saying that this may also be like the latest iteration within collusive behavior and mirroring that situation and that environment with the real and that comparison with the real world. I was thinking that your paper demonstrated that in Portuguese there was more collusion than in English. So Sabia was more collusive, lenient or reliant rather than Gemini. So why should the language or the choice of a model influence in this collusive outcome?
So,
Well, I think
Denise, please.
okay. One thing that I'd like to highlight is that we don't have a way to determine what's happening. So when we're talking with the LLMs, we know that they are stochastic. So it's not like we can set a seed, which is a usual thing that economists do when working with randomness. And we are not able to get the prediction like in the same path if we use the same seed. We might at every time not for sure. We have some uncertainty in every result. Carlos?
Yeah, and there's another interesting thing that I'd like to add is that the language carries signals, and it carries culture. So the interaction between language and model can produce genuinely different behavior. As you said, Alba, Gemini English with no communication, and with the neutral persona has a volatile pricing. It's exploring the whole space between the Bertrand price and the monopoly price. On the other hand, you have Gemini in Portuguese and Sabia in Portuguese, so they have much more stable paths. And Sabia in Portuguese ramps up gradually. Gemini in Portuguese spikes early and then stabilize. So we can say that we have all this kind of knowledge and language, and they are all interacting in a very complex way. And I think the simulation can give us that's the thing about this simulation, that you can have this type of nuance being highlighted by the model. So I think we don't have very straightforward answer for all this right now, but I think we have the tool to try to understand it.
And I think that building precisely on what you were saying, Carlos, there's so choosing one model or the other does matter in this sense. And maybe maybe we will get to that later on when we talk about policy, but when we are then translating this into real practice, maybe a competition authority wants also to drive its own runs with this to try to predict collusive behavior, then it will matter what type of language they use and what type of model they implement. So I think that this is a quite relevant finding to bear in mind. And maybe Thibault, you want to go on with the next question?
Yeah, sure. So let me ask a question about something that looks irrational. And of course, we know this term is very loaded, right? This is all the behavioral sciences, the bounded rationality, and all that. So what we see, or what you see in the paper and what we see when we read the paper, is that one agent stays above the monopoly price almost the whole game. Now, it seems to me that this has been done in a single run, and the model behaves differently every time you actually press go, as you just say, right? So how stable are the findings of the paper? Is it just an outcome that you happen to get in the paper, where you see that once in a while some agents will be quote unquote irrational? Or is it something that indeed we can rely on in forthcoming papers?
Yeah, I'd like to take one step back to say that first of all, it's a very great question, and it's actually it opens the space to talk about the frontier this kind of simulation opens up. For starters, as I said before, we know that the prompt, for example, impacts the output. So the result that you were talking about is obtained with the active persona, and we have different personas in the simulation, so which has to actively explore opportunities to maximize the profit. So the simulation with the neutral persona had naturally different trajectory. But that here's the thing: to what extent should we even expect that these homo silicos to behave like the homo economicals? That's the thing about the rationality. I'd argue that this type of behavior is not a bug; it's a feature, actually. So you asked if it just one run. I think it's not. We have another papers that build up on the same setup, and they run many more simulations. They show this isn't a peculiar to a single seed. So we know that for this type of system, as I said before, you have, in my opinion, you have a complex dynamical system. You, Thibault, have written a paper recently about how we needed to move maybe from the behavioral economics framework to the complex economics framework. So I think that that's an important thing to add up. That, for example, you said that we had a type of irrational behavior, but I think when you think about this system as a complex system, we know that he has some sensitivity to initial condition. For example, a small latency, the API can make the model go in a different trajectory. You can remember, for example, for the butterfly effect that Loris talks about when you have complex systems. So you have path dependency and all this and all these things, all these characteristics make me think about these make me think about if we have to expect the model to behave the same way that the theory and all other models said that we should expect. So I think
Yeah,
this
it
the
actually made me think of, when reading the paper, the work of Brian Arthur and his concept of ill-defined economic systems, where if all the agents do something that looks rational, it opens the possibilities of exploiting what appears to be irrational, but in fact as a way to extract more profits. And then all the agents observe that, and so that readjusts all the time, which is why it's a complex economic system. So this is why I was using the term irrational between huge brackets. But back to you, Alba.
And so building on that irrationality and maybe deviation from reality, so the pricing algorithms that firms actually use don't really talk to each other, although irrationally, again, we might have a more, I would say, anthropomorphic deviation to think that they do. So your agents collude precisely because they do communicate with each other. So is this a real danger in actual markets, or did the collusion only appear within the paper because you let these two firms talk to each other?
Well, for me, this is a real fear and a growing one. Real markets are moving toward exactly the condition of our sandbox, as I said before, not away from them. There is increasing communication in the broad sense. We have today shared data environments, public price feeds, common platforms, and analytics vendors. And there's more volatility with repricing at ever lower latency. So today we are having a more of a share, and the share is in a very low latency. So we have the share happening all the time between companies. Our result says that the requirements for tacit collusion are minimal. Like in this paper, we only had a profit objective, a data, and the repeated interaction. And with that, we get the results that were similar to collusion in every interaction, even the one where they were not talking to each other. The communication only modulates the trajectory. In fact, in our runs, communication delayed convergence by roughly 150 rounds. So it doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen. It would just take longer to happen because the agents coordinate cautiously. So the honest answer is the danger does not depend on the firms talking. and every trend in digital markets pushing toward the scenario where it emerges on its own.
Future.
Yeah, I think we have one example in our work. We have recently launched a technical note that is from an airline case. 2 airlines in Brazil. We have 3 airlines, but the competition happens more between 2 of them, which are Go and Latam. We have two firms that have most of the market and compete a lot, and we made tons of economic tests, and we saw that they somehow used the other prices to define its own price. And based on that, and based on the tools that they share, like market tools that are used for every company, we suggest that the firms work on them. Like we are just the general superintendency and we are doing the first note. After that, we have a administrative procedure that will happen, and the firms might say that we are wrong, and then like in a few years it will end in another technical note from the general superintendents, and then it will go to court. So just say our opinion, I think it's in this note, like when firms have tools that might share information in real time, in my opinion they are able to collude. They have the tools to do that.
Which is, I'll direct the question to you actually, Carlos. So that's a theory of mine. So feel free, by all means, to criticize it. We know from antitrust, and it seems to be true all over the world, that if you share information about the past, that information is said to be public, right? And therefore, it's not a collusion. So if I share all the prices I applied last year, it's fine for me to put that out there and for my competitors to have a look at it. Now, it seems to me that the more it goes, the more we can actually use AI to detect patterns and potentially to use that as a way to signal to competitors, look at the patterns. And from that, please derive what's going to be my next strategy so that you can adapt and potentially have the very same. It seems to be connected to what you are saying indeed. So what do you make out of that? Is that completely wrong or is it stupid?
So I would say that given I can start from what Tanise just said, that in this case, for example, we are trying to build the concept that you don't have the firms to talk to each other. You even don't need to have two LLMs talking in the sense that we had in the paper. So you have two pricing algorithms. Don't think just about LLMs. You had two pricing algorithms in some way, just sharing information or sending information for each other. I think you have, for example, you have cases when they share the same data source. So if they share the same data source, think about a hub. When you have two companies sharing the same data from that hub, and they can just adjust their price almost in real time. That's another important thing, that you have the dynamic algorithm pricing today. They can adjust the prices just very fast, so much faster than we consumers can just try to think about the price. So this distorts the market. And about, you said about new ways to think of collusion and signals of collusion. In our case, in the case that Denise just mentioned, we started to explore all these other types of tools that I was talking about, the tools that the complexity framework gives us. That if you have two dynamical if you have a dynamical system, a complex dynamical system, they just have mathematical properties that you can derive from those systems, and you can then try to understand how coupled those two agents, for example, are. So I think now we have to open our minds as agencies. Here it is just my opinion, of course, but we have to open our mind as regulators, just to try to understand how this other types of framework and what they can give us, where, because we have another type of systems. That's the real thing. We don't have the same systems that we had before. We don't have the meeting of mind of silicon minds. This does not exist. So we have to think about another ways to attack this problem. I think that.
I just like to compliment. I think when you say past information, it's important that we somehow define what's past, like a second before it's past. And I don't think it would be really, I don't know, in the law to share information a second ago. Also, the granularity. So I don't think that firms should share information that were in a very low level, like very granular. And I think what you said, Thibault, relates with Harrington's paper about sharing public information. I think it's more in speeches, his paper, like a firm saying that, well, the conditions of the market have changed, but I think it's related with that too.
Yeah. We also published a paper, when was that? In 2023, entitled Information and Transparency Using Machine Learning to Detect Communication Between Firms, in which they show that, as far as I remember, in Canada, in Alberta, in the electricity markets, the firms will raise prices for just a couple seconds here and there as a way to send signal to the others, like always, like almost like in Morse, right? This language where you tap on the table and you can understand what's happening. So it seems to be indeed that sharing information about right now or even the past could be used for collusion. But let me now move on to the final part of the discussion, part 3 on enforcement, right? So let's try, in a sense, to take the entire conversation we've been having over the last 25 minutes and see what it means for competition agencies. So for the competition agencies listening to us, what could they do today rather than in 5 years to actually make or to put your paper to work? So what would be the practical steps for agencies to utilize what you've just published with us?
Well, I think the first steps try to understand the paper and all the limits that the simulation that we propose there have. I think the agents can adapt this type of simulation for the problem that they have. And I think the step 2 is a resourcing decision, because the agents must know if they are willing to pay for API credits to call commercial models or run something locally. You know, this choice has real consequences. You know, right now we have very capable local models, and we have papers that show that you can run this type of simulation using local models. So I think now is the bottom line is that is relatively cheap tool for most antitrust agents to stand up. So, and it can surface real insights very fast.
The only thing that I'd like to add is that I think simulations might be treated as research and training instruments. So they might be used and might even be more used than in our paper, just to understand the market and to see how it would go. Not really using and doing the same simulation that we did, but maybe using it with another framework, not in a duopoly, maybe with more firms, to see what happens.
Very nice.
So we are now seeing, for instance, that competition authorities are conducting many market investigations. So you are, for instance, proposing their use there, right?
Yes, I think we might suggest that. We don't often do that in Brazil, so it's not something that I'm very familiar with. We don't have like market studies.
Okay. But maybe it's something that we can explore and maybe export to other jurisdictions, hopefully in Brazil as well. So to finish up the presentation we had, and we have called it the big and beautiful final question, which is basically how it relates how it all relates to collusion and how we interpret collusion. So collusion needs a meeting of minds, as we were talking. Your agent reach the price while also denying the existence of this agreement. So does that requirement, the meeting of minds, have to survive, or are we going to have a change towards capturing this type of conduct from its outcome and not from the finding of this meeting of the minds?
Well, in my opinion, that's the central point of this conversation. I think that nowadays algorithmic collusion has created a very comfortable position for firms. It's now very easy to collude without colluding. Like we might just have identical prices or super competitive level of pricing and no agreement anywhere to just prove it. So the firm might honestly say that nobody have ever met like competitors, and so they have never agreed, and they would be right. In my view, this demands a real shift in how we frame liability. The question should move from did they agree to what did they choose to expose themselves to. And if they have chosen to expose themselves to lots of information that wouldn't or shouldn't be public or available, they should be punished for that. Adopting a dynamic privacy environment with certain properties like low latency, which I spoke before, or rich rival data, and an adaptive algorithms is a business decision. And unlike a meeting of minds, it's observable and provable. So many times we are not able to prove the meeting of minds, but we might see the result of which could be from a meeting of minds or for just two algorithms in the same level. I think the debate we need to have is whether mere access to that kind of pricing environment under specific market conditions can itself ground liability. Closer to how strict liability works in other areas of law. Because if we keep waiting for the agreement, we might be waiting for a long time and they will never exist again in this economy. Carlos?
I just like to add that what Tanise said and all the scenario that we are talking about just enforce reinforce my argument that maybe we have to shift from how we analyze the market signals. That's I think is the thing. For example, you have many agents trying to talking about how to make algorithm auditing just to try to understand what's inside of the firm's algorithms and all of that. The first question that we always ask is, what algorithm do you want? What algorithm are you talking about? And this give me another thing that maybe we should move from, maybe since analyzing our auditing algorithms is not a very easy capacity to build inside our agencies, maybe we could evolve our methods, that our screening methods. So I think we just need to know how to analyze this type of signal that we have, that is the outcome from this type of market where we have just algorithms interacting with each other and sharing information. So that's
Okay, let me add a bonus question. So you talked about screening method and signals, and that reminded me of something I just saw that was published just a couple hours ago. So I'm not expecting any of you to be aware of that. That's the super futuristic question, right? Anthropic, the company behind Claude, just announced a couple hours ago again that they were able to identify what they call the G space. So what it is something which is pretty known in neuroscience. It's a space within the brain where basically your thoughts become consciously accessible, right? And what they were able to show is that even in the use of Claude, whatever the model is, there are the things that Claude will give you as an answer. But before that, there is the G space in which Claude is quote unquote thinking about what should be said and not. And they explain in their paper that this is observable, right?
Mhm.
So here's my question. If that is indeed true, it would mean that you could have two algorithms colluding without communication or with communication, regardless of the parameters. But it would be possible, going back to the screening methods, for a competition agency to actually access the G space and see what was going on at the time the decision was chosen by the algorithms. Is that something that sounds like a beautiful idea that would complement what you've had in the paper, or is it too science fiction for us to use?
Well, in my opinion,
No,
I
no
think you
spots.
would. I think my opinion would be great. Of course, I will read this paper, but I think we can say that all those systems emit signals. So I always be convinced that we can, given that signals, try to make the reverse engineer of those signals. So try to understand if even if we can't have actually what the model was thinking in a way, you have like fingerprints in the outcomes that the model have. So I think we can make this, we can develop tools to try to understand. how it thinks about something.
Well, just complementing Carlos, the first thing I'd like to say is that we're not suggesting that every time we see two prices parallel that we go to the company and make a fine. It's not that. It's just maybe it's not CADE that has to prove that having parallel prices is illicit. Maybe the company should come to us and say, well, I have some safeguards that I've used, and with that, even with that, we are in the same price. Like, I think that's one point, like changing the burden of proof that today is very onerous to our side. And the other thing, what you said, Thibault, and this paper that you said is, I think it's like, it opens lots of doors for us. If we could access the G-space, we were able to understand what happened, like in the black box. And it would be amazing. It would, I think, make our work very easier.
Yeah, indeed. So all the literature around black boxes may find a door, right, toward the black box. We'll put the link to the paper. It's called, Anthropic published it under the webpage called The Global Workspace in Language Models, the 6th of July, 2026. We'll put the link in the show notes for everyone interested. So indeed, something maybe for the future. All right. On that, Alba, do you want to add anything or?
No, just maybe wrap up and thank both Tanise and Carlos for joining us here today, being on the podcast. I think that it was a very fruitful conversation with maybe loads of questions that have been left not unanswered, but I would say that they have left some leeway for more research to come our way and to be cemented and to build this computational antitrust framework that we are aiming towards. So thank you so much, Tanise and Carlos, for joining us. And we hope that we can meet somewhere in the world, so maybe Brazil or maybe Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.